Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this happy celebration. I'm Lori Stevens. I'm the Associate Dean for Development and External Relations here at the Divinity School. And I'm thrilled you can join us for what will be surely a thoughtful and thought-provoking conversation as we celebrate Nitin Nohria as our Gomes honoree. I'm just going to share a few technical points and then turn it over to Susie Hayward, who's the chair of the Alumni Council, also as we informally call it the Alumnix Council, and she'll really open the program. As we start, we'd love to hear and see where people are joining us from. So if you'd like to, please in the chat, type in where you're joining from, and if you'd like to include your HBS or HDS affiliation, we'd love to see that. One technical note there, the default of your chat is pointing towards all panelists, but if you change it to all panelists and attendees, then everybody can see what you're typing, which is nice. Next technical note is we're recording this webinar and we're broadcasting it live on Facebook Live. We'll send you a copy of the recording afterwards, and we will also send you a survey, and we really welcome your feedback. And then last technical note, we're gonna have Q&A right around 2:45. I'll rejoin then and help facilitate that. But feel free to type your questions into the chat anytime between now and then, and I'll just read through and pull themes and maybe combine a few questions if there are many, but really just anytime you'd like, type your questions in. And now I'm going to turn it over to Susie with tremendous thanks for her leadership of the Alumnix Council.
Thank you, Lori, and hello, everybody. It's wonderful to join you from Washington, D.C. My name is Susie Hayward, and I'm a 2007 graduate of HDS, and I have served this year and for just a couple more days as chairwoman of the HDS Alumnix Council. The Alumnix Council is a diverse body of 14 alum from across class years and programs, and one current student representative. We all volunteer for a 3-year term to work with the school to support engagement within the Alumnix community and between alum and the school. Every year, the council's chair chooses a theme that guides our programmatic work. So last summer, I chose the theme of border crossings for this academic year. I chose that theme to encourage reflection on how the study of religion leads one to cross many different kinds of borders, including those geographic, disciplinary, categorical, much less that tenuous and porous border between the profound and the profane. By crossing these borders that we know well can be locations of violence, religion scholars and HDS alumnics from across the world are also creatively engaging them and transforming them. Now, as I noted a couple weeks back when we did part 1 of the virtual Gomes celebration, I chose this theme before a global pandemic that does not abide national borders, at the same time that it reveals the violence caused by certain socially constructed and reinforced borders. And I chose this theme before the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, and the rising up of peaceful protests nationwide to demand the eradication of violent policing of racial boundaries that maintain white privilege and power. In the midst of this extraordinary time, I know that I've been thinking anew about borders and what religion and business, and a shout out here to all of the business school friends who've joined us, what both religion and business have to do with both maintaining and transforming borders. Each year, the Alumnix Council's yearly theme is also used to guide us in the selection of the Gomes honorees. The Gomes Honors was established in 2013 to recognize a diverse group of extraordinary HDS alumnics, as well as one friend of the school, a non-HDS alum who has contributed in meaningful ways to HDS. We hold close the spirit of the late, great Reverend Dr. Peter J. Gomes in the work of selecting the honorees, a man who I'm sure would have a whole lot to say both about border crossings and about this moment in our national history. A couple weeks ago on June 10th, we celebrated this year's 4 Alumnix honorees. If you missed that webinar, you missed out, but fear not, because you can find the recorded video on the HDS website, and I believe Anissa will throw it into the chat box for you to save and watch later. I recommend it to you. Our honorees were incredible, and they offered powerful testimony and reflection on the border crossing theme as it applies to the current moment. And we gather today for part 2 of our virtual Gomes Honors Celebration to recognize this year's Friend of the School, Gomes honoree Dean Nitin Nohria from Harvard Business School. Dean Nohria has done much in the spirit of One Harvard to nurture intellectual and practical engagement between the divinity and business schools, about which you will learn a lot more shortly. So thank you and congratulations to Dean Nohria. Before I turn it over to the illimitable Dean of Harvard Divinity School, David Hempton, I want to offer a huge shout out to this year's Gomes Committee Alumnix Council members, Letty Garcia, Matthew Hoyt, Sahar Shahid, and Chairwoman Michelle Goldhuber. This committee put in countless hours throughout the year to collect and read through the nominations they received from fellow alumnics and from HDS faculty, to do research on the nominees, and to consult carefully and thoughtfully with one another in order to present a diverse slate of honorees. So thank you to Michelle and the entire Gomes committee for your hard and thoughtful work. And now, with gratitude for all that he has done to support and engage this year's Alumnix Council and the Alumnix community more broadly, as well as the support that we've received from him through the Gomes Honors process, I will turn the mic over to the Alonzo L. McDonald Family Professor of Evangelical Theological Studies and the John Lord O'Brien Professor of Divinity. I only learned this morning he has 2 professors in one, not surprisingly. Harvard Divinity School Dean David Hempton. So please take it away, Dean Hempton, with Dean Nohria. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Susie, and also add my thanks to the Gomes Committee for their extraordinary work this year. I really appreciate so much of what you've done. A warm welcome to everyone joining us. It's so good to see familiar names on the chat line of people who have supported our school over many years. A special welcome to President Larry Backow and former deans Bill Graham and George Rupp for joining us today. So if we were doing this live in person, we often begin recognizing our distinguished guest by reading a little tribute to him in the Andover Chapel. But since we can't do that, I'm going to do it anyway, and we will then begin our conversation. So this year we're delighted to recognize Nitin Nohria, Dean of Harvard Business School and the George F. Baker Professor of Administration. Though my friend and colleague never attended Harvard Divinity School yet, he is steeped in the experience of a respectful multi-religious community that HDS aspires to model. Growing up in India, Dean Nohria's family instilled in him the values of duty, diligence, dignity, and generosity in accordance with their understanding of the Hindu concepts of dharma and karma. He was educated at a Catholic school where he encountered Christian prayer and theology, and from his Muslim friends he learned much about the faith and values of their tradition. As a result, Dean Nohria carried with him into his career in business and academia a passion for diversity and inclusion and a deep respect for the world's religious traditions. Now, as Dean of the Harvard Business School, Nitin leads an organization dedicated to educating leaders who make a difference in the world. A scholar who has spent over 30 years on the HBS faculty, he studies human motivation, corporate transformation and accountability, and sustainable economic and human performance. But it is his belief in religious literacy, his understanding of its importance for leaders in all fields, and his commitment to ethical leadership that has made him one of Harvard Divinity School's great friends and status defenders. As you know, he stepped across the river to help us celebrate our bicentennial and took part in a very important three-way conversation among Harvard deans, which did so much to elevate the Divinity School's contribution to One Harvard. So for his support, for championing the inclusiveness that lies at the center of HDS's mission. Dean Nohria was recognized earlier this year by the school's Alumni Council as a 2020 Peter J. Gomes honoree. Congratulations, Nitin. Delighted to be with you today, and I only wish we could celebrate in person on the HDS campus.
Thank you so much, David. I am truly touched and moved by this recognition. I wish my mother were alive because she always used to complain that I was short, 5'6". Today, you've already made me feel much taller. So thank you very much for this, and to the Gomes Committee and to all your alumni to recognize me in this way. It's an honor to me.
Thank you so much. So Nitin, let's begin our discussion with where you started. So tell me a little bit, if you wouldn't mind, about your upbringing in India, especially around the religious and ethical influences on your life. And how do you think that that background has influenced your ethics and values to this day?
So in some ways, David, in your introduction, you said a few of the things that are really important to me. Anybody who's been to India, I often say in India, religion hangs thick in the air. It's one of the places where you cannot escape religion in any way, shape, or form. It's the noise and the color and the very fabric of India is woven with religion in every strand. It's in the movies, it's in the culture, it's in the billboards, it's everywhere you see it. So I grew up in a Hindu family. My father was and continues to be a practicing, very serious Hindu who had read the scriptures and was deeply devoted to it. I went to a school from the very earliest days. I went to schools that were Catholic schools. I learned the Lord's Prayer, Our Father in Heaven, before I learned any Indian prayer. So I knew how to say that well before I learned actually how to complete any Indian prayer. I was very fortunate that our neighbors growing up were Muslim. I actually wish I had learned more about Islam from them. But in some ways, I grew up in a country in which religion, the country was founded on the basis of a partition which separated us from Pakistan. So there was both the sense of conflict that religion can bring, but also as a secular nation, the enormous opportunities that religion can bring in terms of creating pluralistic understanding. So it was very much a growing up in which I learned that the great religions at their core try to teach us how to live a good life. The people that I met who were of different religions, I never experienced them as having aspirations for their life in terms of how they wanted to live that were different from my own. So I came to very deeply appreciate that at its core, religions allow us to reach a life that is full of both personal meaning as well as a sense in which we can be great public citizens. So that was an important part of my upbringing. Certainly as a Hindu, you grow up with the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the two great Hindu texts, as a constant metaphor for our lives. And from the Bhagavad Gita, which is a section of the Mahabharata, the ideas of dharma and karma were, I don't even know how many times I was told those concepts that they almost became second nature to me, which is, you have to always understand the duty of the role that you have. And in the end, all you control is karma, which is your actions, because there's nothing else that you can really control. And outcomes in life are determined by many, many things beyond your control. What you can control is your action. So you must always take action. So those ideas have been deeply important to what I think of as my core values, a concept of making sure that whatever religion you embrace, and I would not consider myself as religious as my father, but I would consider myself to be someone who deeply believes in the values of trying to live a good life and a life in which you gain honor for yourself and in the ways in which you conduct yourself, you gain honor through your role and your dharma and karma.
Yeah, thank you. I hadn't realized it just as clearly as you were speaking that in a sense, we're both outsiders at Harvard and that we both come from places that as a result of empire and religious difference, we come from countries that had borders inserted in them, that had ancient roots around these kinds of divisions. So I do think, you know, as I heard you speak, it kind of resonated with some of my own experiences of seeing both the best and the worst of religion, you know, the conflict and the animosity and the rival aspirations. But like you, I grew up in a family where the values were, you know, strongly propagated, especially by my mother, around faith and compassion and generosity of spirit and leading an ethical life. So it is striking just how you know, similar our backgrounds are in that respect. But I came from a family where all of my older male siblings went into business, and I became the nerdy academic at the end of the line. But you didn't go down that route. You came to the United States, and business became a major academic interest. How did that happen? Tell me a little bit about that journey.
So to be honest, David, my becoming an academic, I describe myself quite often as an accidental academic. I think I was very much like your older siblings and wanted to get into business. I studied chemical engineering, and I often joke that the only thing I learned when I was studying chemical engineering is I didn't want to be a chemical engineer for the rest of my life. I knew that was not what I was cut out to be. I was a middling student at best in chemical engineering, but I was very drawn to things that felt more closer to the humanities. I'd taken one economics class as an undergraduate, and that appealed to me immensely. But I really wanted to be an entrepreneur. I grew up in India, in which at that time, India was still very much under the yoke of socialism, and everything was very controlled. The government issued licenses, and it turned out that licenses were largely issued to create businesses for people who already were wealthy. So if you were a young, aspiring person who wanted to create your own business, it just felt like a very steep landscape to have the opportunity to open your own business. And America had this kind of, I guess it has always had for so many immigrants, this fantasy of the American dream and a place where there was opportunity. And if you had your own enterprise and initiative, maybe you could make something of your own life. So I wanted to come get an MBA and maybe take a crack at becoming an entrepreneur. At some point I learned, though, that there was one challenge, which is in 1984, when I was applying to business schools in the United States, MBA programs rarely gave scholarships to international students. So a cousin of mine who was studying at MIT said, why don't you apply for a PhD? You know, if you get into a PhD program, they'll give you a scholarship. I said, but I'm not sure I want to be an academic. He says, well, you know, then you can be sure you'll stay in India. So you can choose, you choose which one of these things you'd rather have. And so purely because I needed a scholarship to be able to leave India and to come abroad, I figured, well, maybe a PhD is like an advanced master's. I was young. I figured, you know, the difference between 2 years and 4 years is not that much at that stage in my life. And I ended up applying to half the schools for PhD programs. My cousin proved to be absolutely right. I only got one scholarship. It happened to be to a PhD program. I was very lucky. It was at MIT, which was one of the schools that I most wished to attend. So I came here with that in mind, and then almost fell in love with the idea of studying business in a way that I had never imagined. I enjoyed the process of scholarship. I came to meet academics who became role models, who inspired in me the idea that being an academic is like being an intellectual entrepreneur, because in very many ways it is. You have the autonomy to produce your own ideas. In the end, you have to succeed by making your idea successful in an academic marketplace. So it is very much an entrepreneurial pursuit. And I feel very blessed. It's one of those things where I have often felt that my life has had too many happy accidents. And there's some, perhaps my father's faith, which he always felt. He always said that he said to me one day that I believe your life will be a good life because that is my karma. And this was one of those moments where I felt that accidentally I discovered something that would end up being a lifelong passion, which was the study of business.
Yeah, interesting. It's interesting looking back on life with those decision moments. I had a similar moment when I applied for a PhD program as exiting undergraduate life in Queen's University in Belfast. And I had a couple of choices in front of me. One was that I had applied for a kind of fast track position in a major accounting firm, Coopers and Lybrand. And I remember meeting the partner of that firm in Ireland and being bowled over. He was a wonderful person, a real raconteur with a lot of energy. And then soon after I got this, offer to do a PhD at St Andrews University with a state studentship that would finance it. And it was one of those kind of 51-49 decisions that took me to St Andrews and into the academic road. So so instead of a kind of a penniless, hapless dean, I could have been a major force in world accounting. I know.
Well, all I can say, David, is that you made the right choice. We're so fortunate that you made that choice. And as I'm sure you feel too, it's sometimes in life, these moments do end up being, I'm so struck by the, people look at our lives and they imagine that this is the way it must have been. And this is the way it was always meant to be. And then you realize that there are these moments in life where things could have gone left or right, the kind of, and maybe this is why that old poem of, the road not taken or the fork in the road is so powerful, because we all deep in our lives have these forks, and you can only take one direction, and then it leads to a whole different life. And in our case, I know that you, having met you, that these turned out to be magical paths to take.
Yeah. So talking of forks in the road, I don't think either of us ever expected to be deans of school at Harvard until we became deans of schools at Harvard. And we were just joking in the green room before the program started, as we looked at the two photographs of us taken probably a decade ago. And we were joking just what a deanship, what toll it can take on your physical and mental well-being. But be that as it may, we've been deans at Harvard together for almost 20 years, just over 10 years in your case and just under 10 years in my case. How do you evaluate that time, do you think, and as you look back on your life in terms of what you were trying to accomplish at Harvard, at the business school, at One Harvard and beyond? How do you reflect on that decade of service to the business school and to Harvard?
So I've sometimes said that when I became dean of the school, I ended up, and even though I was off the school, had grown up at the school, it's the only employer I've ever had. I joined Harvard Business School when I graduated from MIT in 1988. It's the single employer that I've had the great privilege of now working for 32 years, including the last 10 as dean. But when I became dean, I must have gone out and I spoke to every one of our faculty members. I spoke to many alumni, deans of other business schools, probably 500 people in the summer, which was this great gift of time before the fall semester began. And an image that I got from that time was as if I'd been handed a Fabergé egg. People kept saying this is a delicate experiment, which is one of the histories of the school. The school has a book that was written which describes it as a delicate experiment. And it felt like implicit in that message was, don't screw it up, handle delicately. If you mess with this thing, you could just totally ruin the thing. And there were times where I wondered whether I heard more of that because I was not from central casting and a very different dean to begin with, that they were even more worried that, oh my God, we've handed this precious institution to this person who looks like none of his predecessors. Who knows what he might do with it? And I had a sense that it was actually quite different, that rather than thinking of it as a Fabergé egg, a better metaphor was to imagine that this was a fully inflated basketball. That if you dropped it, actually nothing would break, it would just bounce. And the sense in which Harvard Business School was an experiment is that we had to have the courage to watch the bounce and to see which way the institution could be moved forward. And you couldn't bounce it randomly or without any care, but if you bounce it, nothing would break. In fact, 100 years into the school's history, it was a very robust institution. And that what was important was to create a sense in the institution that it could be experimental, it could try different things. And if some things didn't work, nothing would be really lost. And if things worked out, we might continue this great adventure of our first 100 years into the second 100 years of the school, because I came into the deanship just as the school in some ways had finished its centennial and was beginning its second 100 years. So we have tried many experiments, from introducing field programs to the fabled case method at the Harvard Business School, to launching things like the iLab, to changing the relationship between Harvard Business School and the rest of the university. I have often felt that for the first 100 years, I sometimes jokingly say that the relationship between Harvard Business School and the rest of the university was one of splendid isolation. And I felt that there was a great advantage of us being part of One Harvard, that we were lucky to be a part of an institution where every part of the institution was strong, and each school was amongst the best of its kind in all of higher education. And how could we not be better if we were a part of One Harvard? So I think just my decade was very much about how do we make sure that an institution that was very experimental and very bold at its start in its first 20 years, recognized that if it was to have another century that was equally glorious, that it would have to have that boldness of imagination and experimentation, not as a delicate experiment in the sense that you have to be careful, but experimentation in the sense, let's try things out and let's continue to try and forge a new future for the school and its relationship with the university.
No, I think one of the things I've always enjoyed talking with you about is that sense of adventure and experimentation and willingness to press into new directions. And certainly one of the basketballs that I think bounced high was the iLab, which I have always enjoyed visiting and seeing our students visit, and just seeing the impact it's had on the whole university. It's been an extraordinary.
I mean, who would have thought that there'd be Harvard Divinity School people who would win an iLab President's Challenge, and they have, right? So it just proves that these are ways in which people would not have imagined what's possible, and we created it, and our students and faculty always show us what's possible. I think the job of deans is to create the opportunity space in which this amazing collection of people that we have, faculty, alumni, students, and staff, can thrive. And that's how I've often thought about kind of my job as dean.
Yeah. So one of the things that we talked about a number of years ago, which has come to fruition, is in terms of collaboration between our two schools, is this endowed chair, which you helped us create in religion, business ethics, and the economic order. And the first practitioner in residence has already started in that wonderful role, and is teaching fine courses on these issues. How would you like to see that develop in the future in terms of the relationship between our two schools, or what you think might be possible, or how we can think better around these complicated issues of ethics and business and the economic order, how it's gotten to be the way it is, and so on. Do you have thoughts on that?
So I think that it's such a multi-layered set of opportunities. I think that this chair represents, and the chair is, I think, symbolic of a broader partnership that one should be imagining and thinking about. So the first thing that I've said is that, and this was one of the goals of our field program at Harvard Business School, where we sent students out to all parts of the world to try and understand how business would be different in India relative to the United States, or different in Brazil relative to India or any other part of the world. And the ultimate goal there was not that we were going to get our students in 10 days to become smart about India or China or Brazil, because it's almost arrogant to believe that in 10 days you can get someone to understand a whole nation. But it was to build what we thought of as contextual intelligence and humility, which is to know that you have to understand the context of another country or another people fully. And what works in one part of the world would not necessarily work in another part of the world unless you approach that other part of the world with humility and with some desire to understand that context better. Now, in the United States, we sometimes act as if because we're a secular country in which we've had this separation of church and state that is so deeply embedded into our nation that it isn't in fact a country in which Christian values inform a large part of our business. Whereas if you go back and actually understand the history of business, whether it's great companies like Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, some of the great long-lived companies in this country, many of them had business leaders who had deep Christian values that that inspired them to build their businesses and that continue to animate now in a more secular form, these companies. But if you go to a place like India, or you go to the Middle East, or you go to other parts of the world, if you don't understand the religious context in which these places operate, I saw that one of our truly dear colleagues, Sam Hay, someone from his family is here. And he, for example, used to teach a course at Harvard Business School on Islamic finance, on international finance, in which he said, so many multinational banks, which were successful in every other part of the world, ended up having very little success in Islamic countries because they just didn't understand that what is Sharia and how do you have Islamic banking? And it's not like you can't do banking in those countries. Now, many years later in the 21st century, finally, there are banks that have learned to operate, international banks that have learned to operate in those contexts. So the first sense in which I hope this chair and the work that we do is that it'll educate students to better understand that religion is a deeply vital part of the context that you must understand in order to do business in any part of the world. But the other sense in which I think it is equally important is that, we talk about leadership at Harvard Business School as a combination of knowing, doing, and being. Knowing is mastery of a body of knowledge that you can apply with judgment to different situations. Doing is translating that body of knowledge into action, that you actually take action. But being is the sense of character and the values and the ethics through which you operate, because in the end, you're going to be judged as a leader as much for your character and your sense of being as you will for the decisions that you take or how knowledgeable you are or how much action you can take. And I think that inner journey that allows people to come to terms with what are their values, how will their values inform their conduct in public life. At the business school, it's very often in the realm of business, but it's not entirely in the realm of business. Many of our students will go into the nonprofit sector, some of them will go into government, but trying to make sure that our students understand that their values, whether they come from a secular place or they come from a religious place, and if they come from a religious place, they should feel as comfortable and confident owning those values as if they come from a more secular or even an atheistic tradition. But values are essential to good leadership. Because I've often said to my students that if you fail the test of competence, people will give you another chance. If you fail the test of character, it's hard to get another chance. So I do think that my great hope is that in some ways, this chair, as well as the budding opportunities of work that we might do with each other, will allow our students to more deeply understand the root of where values come from and how to make sure that they have that North Star in terms of some clarity about the values by which they wish to live their own lives.
Yeah, thank you for a very eloquent answer. I think, as you know, Nitin, this chair in religion, business ethics, and the economic order is part of a kind of I think what I might call an outward-looking set of ideas around the Divinity School and its future. And we've just building right now a school-wide initiative on religion and public life, where religious literacy is a big part of what we're trying to instill around not just business, but journalism, professions, government, a whole range of things. So I know that this outward-looking focus is something that does excite you as well. And I was just wondering, you know, from the business school's point of view, you know, how things have gone with this international effort that you've, you know, to allow your students or encourage your students or insist on your students gaining experience outside the United States and engaging with these bigger issues. I mean, what's the kind of interim report on that? How would you evaluate the success of that particular basketball?
So I think that of the things that in the 10 years that I've done, that I feel amongst the things I feel happiest about is the success that these global field immersions have had. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, you know, initially some of our international students who were from emerging markets used to say, well, you know, but I already know emerging markets, so what am I going to gain from going to an emerging market? But when students from India went to Brazil, they said, you know, yes, Brazil might be another emerging market, but it's not India. And there's something quite different about operating in Brazil. Or when Chinese students went to India or Indian students went to China. And certainly when international, you know, when our American and European students went to all of these parts of the world, there was a way in which their sensitivity and understanding, not just of what was happening in the country, but how when they went in small groups of 6, they each had to understand the experience that they were each having in these countries. Mm-hmm. That was a very powerful lesson too, which is why am I reacting in this one way? And if David is with me and is a fellow traveler, we're both seeing the same things, but he's seeing something different than I'm seeing. What informs that difference? So it didn't just leave. So one thing I've learned is that these engagements in public life actually lead to inner conversations that are different. They're not just about understanding the outside world, because a confrontation with the unfamiliar and a confrontation with the unfamiliar with other fellow travelers leads to a inward journey that is a very powerful inward journey as well, where you have to come to terms with what your experience means to you. So what excites me immensely, David, about the work that you're trying to do is that as your students find opportunities to, of course, deeply understand the text and the meaning behind the religious traditions that you help them understand, if they then navigate the reality of how those traditions are practiced in the world and how they come together in the world, I think that understanding will be a deeply powerful understanding. If you indulge me, I want to share one other example, one other story, which is one of the most powerful teaching experiences I've ever had in my time at Harvard was a course that I jointly taught with Diana Eck from your school in FAS, with Marshall Gans from the Kennedy School, Bernie Steinberg, who at that time was the director of Harvard Hillel. And it was all done at the urging of one of our joint students, Rob Rogers, who used to be a student at Harvard Business School and then got a master's degree at the Divinity School in his mid-career. We taught it in the January term. It was a 1-week-long course. It was called Faith and Leadership in a Fragmented World. We got 90 students from every religious tradition to come. And we taught case studies that Diana Eck had written. We taught case studies from her business school. We learned from Bernie how to do Havruta, which is the close reading of Jewish texts and that tradition. We learned from Marshall Gans what public, you know, his whole strategy of public dialogue and self-narrative. It was the most extraordinary experience I've ever had to get people together who were quite skeptical about whether we could have conversations about how religion affected public life, because it was all about how does religion influence the public sphere. That was does it create fragmentation, or can it in fact lead to some opportunity to move beyond conflict? We were doing the course in the wake of 9/11 and many other things, when religion did seem to be a very divisive force in the world. So it was a profound course, and in some ways, one of my great laments is I became dean actually within a year of that course being taught. And I wish we had had more time to continue that course, because that could have been the foundation of a conversation that could have provided the seed corn for the kind of initiative that you're now trying to think about.
Yeah, thank you for that. And my understanding is that there's an effort to to do another J-term course where our two schools will collaborate this coming J-term. So thank you for that piece of encouragement. As we get towards the end of our time, I'd like to ask you a really difficult set of questions around business and the wider world. I mean, you know very well that there are increasingly sustained attacks on global capitalism as an economic system and its role in increasing inequality, contributing to climate change, and even exacerbating racism and white supremacy. And I see, you know, there was an op-ed online in the New York Times today from Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, with a similar kind of urging that things need to change in global capitalism. And I was reminded of the event last year, this time last year exactly, that the business school put on, you know, Dialogue 2019, which I went to, and presumably you had a role in designing and thinking about that. And I received the conference publication and looked at the kind of, you know, the 5 takeaways about the future. So my question really to you is, as faith in global capitalism, especially among current student generation, and it would certainly be true in our school, what do you think that capitalist structure can change? And if so, in what directions do you think it needs to change in order to thrive and contribute to human flourishing from, you know, going forward?
So, you know, I'll say 2 things, David, and happy to answer more questions as people want to raise them. First, you know, I grew up in a socialist country. So part of the reason why I came to America is because I know how stultifying sometimes a country can be in which you don't allow for individual freedom and you don't allow for free markets to function. So there is a certain very deep sense in which I believe that capitalism can be an enormous source of human flourishing, prosperity, and freedom. So I am deep in my soul a believer that at its best, capitalism can be a force for good. At the same time, I will readily admit that capitalism is not today lifting all boats and absolutely needs to have a careful look at itself to ask the question, how must it be reimagined to create prosperity that lifts more people and allows more people to get the opportunity that it promises? Because it's clearly not delivering that. Also, there has long been this boundary in the literature around capitalism between what we think of as private goods and what have been described as public goods, things like the environment, things like education. I think business has become such a powerful force in society that this idea that it is somehow separate from society, and as long as it produces a profit that produces taxes that can then be used, or it contributes through charity that can then be used by NGOs, its job is done. That is no longer an adequate definition of where the boundaries of business can be drawn. I think business has no choice but to start to take these big public goods issues as matters that are central to its own concerns. Businesses must undertake how to reduce the environmental impact they're having, how to reduce inequality, how to make sure that the racial divide that business can perpetuate wittingly and unwittingly is diminished. I think these matters, which were previously left by business people in the realm of, well, government should take care of that, or nonprofits should take care of that. Our job is to simply, as they used to say in business, if I produce a good profit, everything else can be taken care of by other organs in society. The laws, government should take care of that. I don't think that that is a sustainable idea for business going forward. We have in the last decade pushed hard at the business school to start to ask these questions of how we can reimagine capitalism. Rebecca Henderson, one of our colleagues who I think has also had close ties with the Divinity School built one of the most successful second-year electives at our school called Reimagining Capitalism. We have now brought that course into our first-year required course called Leadership and Corporate Accountability. So we're trying to make sure that every one of our students now asks this question, which is, what can business do to proactively embrace and tackle these large questions that society desperately needs to have tackled and in which business must play a role, which ranges from inequality to climate change to creating more pathways of opportunity to making sure that groups of people like our Black community and other underrepresented minorities who have felt cut out of the sphere of business and have not seen as many opportunities in that sphere feel that more opportunities being created for them and that business can be a force that lifts their boats too. So I think that these are questions that we must answer and will be the most important questions that will continue to go forward for the next decade or two for business. We have to find answers to these problems.
So I thank you for that. I mean, a couple of the takeaways that were in the Dialogue 2019 report is that that business organizations themselves must catalyze change within their own cultures. And secondly, that encourage leaders to look inside themselves at values, patterns of behavior, honest self-reflection. So in a way, these are things that, you know, that as Dean of the Divinity School, I think are good things to move beyond what Walker called today a kind of conscienceless capitalism. So I suppose my final question to you would be, you know, we are at a very difficult moments in our country and around the world around issues of inequality and environmental damage and racism. Do you have a sense of hope or optimism about the next decade, or especially from the perspective of business, or do you think that there's still a lack of honest facing up to these issues among companies and the business community?
So maybe I'm just a habitual and by nature an optimist, David, but I'll give you examples that give me hope. So I'll take a company like Walmart, right? Walmart in many ways is a company that came to fame because it had just one motto, which is, you know, if we produce cheaper products, that benefits consumers, especially middle-income American consumers who need to make their income stretch farther. It had a maniacal obsession about only one thing: everyday low prices, let's reduce cost. And it was almost as if no other goal was important to Walmart. In the process, while it delivered tremendous value in that way, it had huge environmental footprint. It often had deleterious impact on the people it employed because it gave them low wages. It destroyed small communities and small businesses in small communities, but it was all seemingly justified because in the end, they could say that every consumer in the United States is doing better because we're giving them cheaper products. In the last decade, starting with Hurricane Katrina, which for some reason was a moment that caused David Glass, who was then CEO of Walmart, to just recognize that the amount of pride in the company that came from Walmart just delivering water and other services to people who were affected by Katrina created more credibility for his company than all the ways in which they had tried to give people cheaper products, led him to have a fundamental rethink and to ask the question, how can Walmart be a better force for good now? So he announced, by working with actually he brought what seemed to be the enemy of Walmart, an environmental leader, into the company and developed in partnership with that environmental leader a plan to reduce Walmart's environmental footprint in its logistics chain by 50% in a decade. When that plan was first introduced, Walmart believed that it would add about 3 cents to 4 cents to the cost of every good that they sold. it has proven in a decade to actually lower the cost of everything that Walmart does. So I think the environmental example of Walmart and some vanguard companies, to me, is already creating a movement where companies are beginning to realize that, in fact, if you take on some of these social issues, they don't necessarily have to come at any long-term detriment of profits. In fact, if you have the ingenuity that business is so good at having, you might even be able to take on these goals and produce greater profits while doing greater good. I hope that that lesson is a lesson that we will now apply to issues like inequality and racism. I actually feel quite optimistic that the environmental movement will find growing momentum. You can see that from investors who have created ESG funds, who are going to demand that of the people whom they invest in. To me, what will be interesting to see is that on issues like racism and inequality, where frankly, I don't yet have a good example to share with you, like I have on the environmental movement. I think on the environmental movement, there are now a dozen examples that can provide role models, and hopefully it will lead to a movement. We need a new vanguard of companies that can show progress on things like racism and inequality. And I'm actually one of the most as difficult and as depressing in some ways as this moment has been, where we've had to recognize that so little progress has been made and so much more needs to be made to be given around issues of race in our country. Perhaps this is the moment where business will really step in. And I feel optimistic that we might have examples like Walmart in the next decade that will then provide examples for others to embrace that might cause business to become a force to improve these things, which we must tackle in some way.
Thank you so much, Nitin. I think our allotted time for our conversation is over, but we now have a time for Q&A, and so thank you so much for an engaging conversation. And now I'll turn it over to Laurie to field some questions from our Zoom participants.
Well, you both have naturally answered a couple of the first questions. I think we may see more come in now, but really there are questions about what are actual steps that can be taken to address environmental issues. And I thought that was such a powerful example, Nitin. And then also one of our other Gomes honorees, Ephraim Isaac, asked if you can talk a bit more about ways that HBS and HDS could collaborate to address racism and social inequality. So if you have any further thoughts on examples there, people would love to hear them.
So I think that my own view of this is that we will need truly to revisit all processes that have produced racism. So in some ways, I had a conversation with a colleague yesterday who said to me that, look, we have had a very bad track record at Harvard Business School of being able to tenure Black colleagues at the school. So at some point she says, if we keep believing that all we have to do is tinker with our current processes, maybe we should recognize that the outcomes may not be that different. So I feel that this is a moment in which we'll have to have the courage to look deeply at processes that we have long cherished, right? Like the tenure process in all academic institutions is one that is the heart of our institutions. And similarly, I think in companies, the ways in which people get recruited, the ways in which you decide who to finance, whom to give a loan to, these processes are invested with massive amounts of legitimacy that comes from having done them repeatedly over long periods of time. I think we'll have to find some way to have the courage to ask that if these processes that we are so attached to systematically produce outcomes that disadvantage people who are Black, do we need parallel processes? Do we need other mechanisms? What do we need to do in order to produce gain? And I'll give you a small example. Like, for the longest time, people in business used to believe that higher quality could only be produced at higher cost. The Japanese in the 1980s came up with a whole new management system where they showed just-in-time, Kanban, continuous improvement. It wasn't just an idea, it wasn't just values, it was values translated into management practice that allowed them to break what was a seeming paradox and start to produce higher quality at lower cost. Once they developed those set of ideas, they spread through the entire global landscape, and now nobody believes that those two things are at odds with each other. I think we'll have to reimagine the processes through which all our institutions work, whether they're business institutions or other institutions, to ask the question, what new processes might we need to create different outcomes?
Great question. I have a fun one for you. We have a question where someone asked, Nitin, if you could recommend to all HDS students one HBS course, and David, if you could recommend to all business school students one divinity school course, what would it be?
So if I was only given one, I would say that people should take this class on reimagining capitalism, because I think the voices that that the divinity school students would bring into that conversation would be very productive voices, and equally it might have them believe that there are in fact capitalists who are determined to try and improve these things too. So it could create, as opposed to people othering each other, it might create an opportunity for people to develop a dialogue from which more constructive conversations would occur.
I think on the other side, I would recommend that the students from the business school would either take a course in a religious tradition other than their own, or take a course on constructive ethics and how to think about ethical problems and issues. And I was very struck, I was reading just the introduction to a new book by Ronnie Cohen on impact, and he was talking about Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations, which I read partly as a religious document as well as an economics document. But Smith also wrote about theories of moral sentiments.
I read a book.
Yeah. And so I do think bringing these two things together again, the history of economic thought and the history of ethical thought, which I know one professor at Harvard, Ben Friedman, is writing a very large book on right now, and I think it's just finished and will soon be published. So I think to get some honest engagement there would be wonderful. And I was sharing with Nitin just before the formal part of this started that when I was, as I said earlier, all my siblings went into business and ran, a major company through the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And I think as time moved on, I came to respect those who were generating prosperity, jobs, and hope in communities where unemployment was really high, investment was low, and unemployed young men especially were getting involved in paramilitary organizations toward a life of violence and often criminality. So I've often, and during that, lots of the churches were making well-intentioned statements about how we all need to get together and be nicer and so on. I don't want to judge that too much, but I came to be somewhat suspicious of good intentions, and I came to admire those who made a world of difference in some very tough areas and neighborhoods through generating some employment and prosperity and hope. So for me, collaboration between the two schools would be, bringing into conversation the two worlds we live in as not having to be antithetical, even though we might want to still say that there are things about that other world that we don't like. Again, I'm reminded this Darren Ford thing today about the Securities and Exchange Commission that allowed corporations to repurchase their own stock from the 1980s onwards, and what that's done to the structure of capitalism. And I happen to disagree with the fallout from that and the inequalities I think it's caused. So I think we can respectfully disagree with one another across the Charles, and but I think it would be an absolute shame if we can't ever engage one another in a constructive dialogue like this one.
Thank you, David. I would absolutely echo everything that you said. I actually think that some friction, some disagreement, that's essential in society. No progress is made without that. On the other hand, dialogue, conversation, as you so rightly pointed out, economics at its core was ethics. At some point, it became separated from it. I think the rejoining of economics and ethics is essential in modern society.
So wonderful note to end on, and address some of the other questions that came up. I'm going to turn it back over to Susie to share some closing thoughts. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nitin, so much.
And thank you. Let me add my thanks to both Deans Nohria and Hempton for letting us join you around the dinner table for the conversation. The forces for business and wealth and religion are incredibly powerful in this world. And I'm grateful for the ways in which your relationships with one another and the relationships between the Divinity School and the business school can think really constructively about how to ensure that those influences are mutually informing one another in order to support issues of justice, issues of prosperity for all, and the well-being of all communities. So I am hopeful as well for the ongoing conversation, and grateful to both of you. And congratulations once again, Dean Nohria, and gratitude for all that you have done to support the school. It was recognized with the Gomes Honors Friend of the School. And thank you to everybody else who has joined us today. It was heartening to see in the chats the many accolades that were given by some of our business school friends to Peter Gomes and to his legacy. So the historic relationship between the two schools is longstanding in that sense. We're gonna formally close the webinar now, but we will leave the chat function open for another 5 minutes or so. So feel free to continue to add any further thoughts that you have, or sign in and sign out if you haven't yet done so. And again, thank you for joining us today, and please take care of yourselves.
Susie, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for all you've done. And thank you for, again, this truly wonderful honor. I have often joked with David that I needed a ticket to heaven, and now I have it. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dean Nohria.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye now.
Thanks.